This is Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm LaShawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching. Today, we are diving into one of the most uncomfortable yet essential conversations that every family needs to have. Our guest, Colleen Watson, is the Chief Legacy Consultant at Century Plant Business Services. At heart, she's a planner, someone who thrives on order and roadmaps. But one unexpected day, life threw her a curveball she never saw coming. Instead of breaking her, it opened the door to a brand new mission, helping others plan for the conversations and challenges they'd rather avoid. At Century Plant Business Services, Colleen and her team guide families through one of life's toughest discussions, the talk about aging, finances, and estate planning. Using their 4-pillar approach, they create a safety net that makes even the riskiest decisions feel manageable. And the best part? Once you master this conversation, every other difficult discussion becomes easier. So if you're ready to embrace discomfort, get a plan in place, and step into your most prepared adult self, this episode is for you. So let's get started. Colleen, tell us more about your story and what got you into this work.
So unfortunately, it was a lemons turning to lemonade sort of story that I think a lot of us have. I am my mom's caretaker. Mom's a widow. We lost my dad in 2018. I have 2 older siblings, but they are in other parts of the country and world. So I am her main support system. I live with her. And my mom did a lot of good things. She had a lot of coin in that health bank. She did a lot of things right in her life. So whenever there were bumps in the road, and there were, she turned 89 last month. So she's rocking along. But whenever there were health bumps, because when you get into your 80s, there are health bumps, she recovered really quickly and life went on. And one day that didn't happen. It was April 6th, 2024, remember the exact day, and my mom suddenly had a medical problem that required hospitalizations and then rehab and then me being on call 24/7 while I took care of her at home and gradually getting her back on her feet. And we got to the other side of that, and when you're in the middle of it, you don't care about anything else. You'll spend the money you need to spend. You don't care where it comes from. You'll charge up. You just are focused on this person you love and getting them through. But I got to the other side and went, why didn't you have a plan for this? Right? I'm the planner. I'm the person in my family who was single and childless and had a will before my siblings, who were neither of those things, had a will. Right? Like, I'm the person who thinks ahead. I'm always like trying to figure out where things are. And I didn't make a plan because I didn't want to, because this was my only parent. And I didn't want to think about her being fragile. And there are prices to be paid for that. And luckily, the prices that I paid were pretty minimal. We know families, I think we all have it. The prices that they pay are a lot higher in terms of family implosions, hurt feelings, and all of those things, and that double in your grief because you're already emotional anyway and can rip families apart. So let's make a plan. So I'm like, learn from my mistakes. Let's make you a plan. And I also feel that, like, if you have that plan and you have the safety net, all of a sudden things that you would never think of doing suddenly are like, well, wait, I have the safety net. Why don't I try? I know that things are going to be covered if something goes wrong. I could, dip my toe in and see if this works. And so, part of this was obviously out of something very sad, but something also, it's also out of something very hopeful. Like, oh, wait, like, if you're covered, take some risks. Take that trip that you wanted to take. Or maybe it's time that you purchased the second home, or you purchased the hot tub that you've always wanted in your backyard. All the things that we put off because they seem like luxuries or whatever. Maybe it's time to stop seeing them as luxuries and start seeing them as possibilities. So that's kind of how I got here with Century Plant Business Services.
Colleen, that sounds so hopeful. I love this idea of when you plan well, maybe there is an additional abundance is what I'm hearing. And in recognizing life doesn't always let us plan, right? But when we try with our best efforts, we all we can do is our best. So I'm curious about your story as an entrepreneur throughout all of the, shifting tides of losing your dad and recognizing this need to be planning around, the healthcare system and healthcare bills. What's that road been like for you?
My dad, sadly, had Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is, there's gonna be some language because sometimes language is necessary, but Alzheimer's is a bastard. It robs you of the person long before they pass. And Dad was at home for a long time, and we were able to manage things until we weren't. And we had to put him in an assisted living facility, which was wonderful for him and for my mom. My mom went in every day and fed him his lunch and shaved his face and, make sure that everything was under control. I would go in about 3 or 4 days a week. My sister, who was living in the state at the time, would always come up 1 day a week and feed him his lunch. And so it was very, very difficult, but it was very much day at a time, because that's all you can really do. And got to the end of that. And finally, we lost him in a very peaceful way. And, as sad as it wasn't the heavy sadness of an unexpected loss. It was the beautiful relief of somebody who was at peace, who's been slowly disintegrating before your eyes. And we spent his last day with him, and he had a moment. He was asleep for most of it, but he had a moment where he woke up and he recognized my mom and myself. And I think that was him saying, I'm ready to go. And so we lost him, and obviously you're grieving and you're in mourning. And then, I was a librarian, and I left that career to help my mom take care of my dad. And I was, gearing up to go back to that when a little thing called the pandemic happened. And like most people, I'm looking at my widowed mother who is home alone. And I'm like, oh, we need to figure out something else. I can't go back to full-time work. I can't, be gone for 40 hours a week. And, because she is getting older, and, she, for a very long time, she would never admit that because she was in great health. And, she was still going to Europe in, 2022 and 2023. I'm like, the woman was superwoman. But, when that happened, I was still thinking, like, at some point, like, I can't go back to full-time work. I need to do something where I can be home. I can have my own schedule. And so my initial thing, because I'm a writer and I love writing and I love planning, was I was into marketing. So I was helping people figure out their blogs. The original plan was I was going to write the blogs, and you realize very quickly, like you have a very limited capacity to be able to write quality blogs, which is also means you have a very limited, head for how much you can earn doing that on your own. And I was actually much better at the strategizing piece anyway. So I was shifting into that. I was, launching that when Mom had her fall. And so, it's one of those things where I opened a business with no plan. Did I have a business plan? No, I didn't. Did I have any idea what I was going to sell? Kind of. It was very much a throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what stuck approach, which once again, have a plan. I'm still amazed that I did that. Like, I'm still just like, how? But I was in the pandemic. I had way too much time on my hands. And it was frankly a great distraction to put all the work into figuring out, like, okay, form the LLC and, get a DBA and set up all the things and do the website and, order your business cards, all of that stuff. kept me very busy. And I figured I would just figure it out. And to this day, like being where I am right now, I look back at that and go, who was that? Like, that was not the person I was pre-pandemic. But I think the pandemic changed things for a lot of people. And for me, the goal was build up the business so I could stay home and in case something happened, which sadly it did. When you're once again, when you're in the middle of it, it's a day at a time. It's a day at a time. It's a day at a time. You're not planning futures. You're just trying to get everybody back on their feet and doing everything. But we got through the other side, and it was just like, oh, there has to be a better way to do this. And I started just talking to people. I was talking to, because I had done my will and I put my business in my will, right? There's somebody who's gonna, if something happens to me, there's a plan for the business. And I was at a chamber event, like networking event. I was talking to a lawyer and I said, well, so many people, their babies are their business. And he stopped me and said, most people don't have a plan for their babies, much less their business. Most people don't make wills. And that got the brain turning. What? You put all this time and energy and devotion into building a life. And that life includes stuff. And it includes savings. And presumably you're doing that because you're building a legacy. And that's it? You don't make a plan for it? That made zero sense to me. It just, and as a solopreneur, if I, get sick or something, I guess my business just dies. How many years and money and time and love and effort did you put into that business? And you're just going to say, never mind, it's gone. That made no sense to me. And so that's where the wheel started turning. And I started just talking to people in my local chamber. I'm very fortunate that my local chamber of commerce is very much geared to entrepreneurship and not, say, big corporations. Because depending on where you are in the businesses in that area, if you're an entrepreneur, sometimes that's great and sometimes it isn't, but mine very much is. And so I had, people there who were lawyers and insurance agents and, business professionals and financial people and all of that good fun stuff. So I could, I then proceeded to interrogate many of them and start to, get their vision of like, okay, where do you see the holes? What don't people know when they come to you? And that is where kind of the 4 pillars idea came from, is I was listening to a lot of people saying, well, people come to me and they don't consider this, or they've never thought about that, or, and I have to do, and most people love to educate people, but, your insurance person is not contacting your estate planner, who's not contacting your financial planner. Like, everything's done piecemeal. And let's have a plan going in of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to cover, and see if we can say, let's, even though you're talking to them individually, you can say to your insurance guy, well, for legacy, I want this, but I need, this, I want this, but I need some more life insurance in case something happens, my business and my family can be okay. You know what I mean? You have the forest for the trees sort of view, and you can help your professionals give you what you need to make that happen. And everything is going to kind of work together, because, when you buy things piecemeal, you know what I mean? Sometimes it works and sometimes the puzzle pieces don't fit the way you want them to.
There's so much there, Colleen. And I'm seeing so much about resilience, being able to think on your feet, to pivot very quickly. Even though you did mention several times, I didn't have a plan for this. I didn't have a plan for this. You really recovered quite quickly. And I think, that your nature is, as a planner, that's how you were responding to these shifts and changes. And, I think with COVID, everybody had to take stock of their life and rethink how they were doing things. And, things come up and you have to pivot quite quickly in that environment. There are several things that were coming up for me. One was just the cohesion of all the different pieces and parts that come with future planning, end of life planning that you address in your business. And one thing that came up for me when you were talking about your mother and how resilient she is and how healthy she was before her fall and how you didn't want to have the conversation. That really stuck out for me when you said, I'm a planner and I didn't plan because I didn't want to see how fragile. I didn't want to see the fragility of my parents. I didn't want to see the fragility of my mother. That really stuck in my mind. And I would love to just kind of delve into where you're at now with that and with your clients. When you talk to your clients about that difficult but very necessary conversation, that the fact that we need to accept that we are mortal, that we are not living forever, that our parents will go through, as will we, go through that process of aging and dying, and understanding how we as a family can respond to that and plan for that. What more can you say about that part of your business and also your own personal journey?
So my mother is also a planner. And when my father was in the throes of his illness, wouldn't you know, she got colon cancer. So I'm like suddenly spinning because like I have a job and I have my dad, and suddenly I'm going to have my mom. And once again, her health was on her side. She kicked colon cancer's butt. She had surgery. They got rid of it. It's never come back. And sadly, it was a family thing. My grandmother also got colon cancer and at the same age, ironically enough. But when that happened, my mother's like, okay, here's where everything is. I'm going to put you as beneficiary on my accounts so that you can distribute them. You're going to be the executor of the will. And so, like, I had a parent who was just like, okay, we have an emergency situation, but we have a little bit of time. Let's get everything in order so that you can pick up the ball and run things in case something happens, right? So when this fall happened, and it was a much more long-term thing, all of that stuff was done. And I think it was done in most part because when my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, passed away, her mom, it was a very similar situation. Her husband had died some years before. She was on her own. She was in assisted living. It was a mess. It was a lot of work. And I think my mother, now, grandma did have a will. A lot of people don't. It's kind of scary how many people don't. But she had a will, and, you know, her stuff was all over the place, but at least she had, you know, evidence of all of her accounts and everything that was going on. And, you know, this was, you know, in the early 80s. So we did not live in a time where everything is done online and you have to have, you know, the username and password to get into everybody's stuff. It was much easier to say, go to a bank or call a credit card company, you know, send them a copy of a death certificate, and they closed down an account. And we had fewer accounts back then. I mean, there just wasn't a lot of stuff. And even then, it was a mess. And so my mother was like, I'm going to make this easier. So she, you know, had everything in one place. She just had never told anybody that it was there. So when this happened, she's like, okay, here it is. That's what you do. We went to the bank. We went to her investment houses. I became, you know, I'm on all her accounts. I'm the beneficiary. I'm the executor of her will. She remade her will after my dad passed. So we were good to go. And it's kind of funny, and we do this as people, is our family is one way, and we kind of assume other families are the same way. So I assumed every family had a responsible parent who made sure all of that stuff was done. And you quickly realize, oh no, that is not what happens in a lot of families. So I had a good example to begin with. And I had a good example because my mother had to live with the bad example of dealing with my grandmother's estate. And I mean, it was a lot because she had a brother, but he had predeceased my grandmother. So she was the only one who could do anything, right? And so she had to be the person taking care of all of it and mourning her mother. And while that was hard, in the back of her mind, she's like, I'm never doing this to my kids. I am never doing this to my kids. And, I just want people to not have to learn that lesson. And sadly, sometimes it really is. It's until it happens to you that you make the change, right? Yeah. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can have the plan in place years before you need it. And if you have children, you have to have a plan in place, hopefully years before you need it, right? Because, and this is one thing like parents don't think about, is like, who's getting your kids if, God forbid, the very worst thing happens to you? No parent wants to think about that, right? They don't want to. I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to have, brought these little human beings into the world and then have to consider the possibility of my not being there. But because parents don't do that, they don't think about the short term where, you've gone out on a date night and you've left your kids with the babysitter and there was a car accident and you're going to be fine, but you're going to be in the hospital. There might be some surgery. There might be some physical therapy involved. And you are not going to be able to do full-time parenting for a little bit. That's why you have to have a short-term guardian as well as long-term guardianship plans. And because most people don't want to think about the long-term guardianship plan, they don't consider the short-term guardianship plan. Let's be honest. Hopefully, and odds are, the short-term plan is the one you're going to need, right? If everything goes your way, your children are going to be adults before you leave them. But anybody can get in a car accident. Anybody can, have an accident at work. Anybody can go skiing and, hurt themselves. All of that stuff is very possible. And because your brain is so frozen, stopping at one thing, you don't take care of other things. And that is where most people get into trouble, is they get in brain freeze out of fear. And hey, I get it. Everybody gets it. Nobody wants to think about this. But this is where the adultier adult phrase comes in. It was a quote where, we look around and there's a problem and we look around for the adult. And then we realize we're the adult. So then we look for the adultier adult. The person who knows more than us, who's going to lead us by the hand. And I got news for you. The adultier adult needs to be you, right? It needs to be you. And I can, help you and hold your hand and give you tips and tricks and everything else to have these talks with parents and with your adult children and potentially siblings, those sorts of things. But it's time, if you're going to build a life, you have to at some point be the adultier adult and do the uncomfortable stuff. And that doesn't mean you can't get advice. That doesn't mean there isn't articles out there to help you do it. Take advantage of all the information you can. Take advantage of me. I do free 30-minute consults. Like, you can talk to me about anything. And if it's like, how do I approach my dad because he doesn't accept any kind of help, I can help you figure out how to do that. Perfectly happy to help you figure out how to do that. But like, this is part of the adulthood thing. And yet it's time that we started remembering that a large part of adulthood is living in the land of the nuanced and the uncomfortable, the land of not easy answers, because that is the land also where we're going to have to lead our kids, right? And that is the land where you also develop things like confidence, like grit, like resilience, which are the things that parents want their kids to have anyway, right? But in order to do that, they have to fall so they can get up again. And, they have to experience all the feels. They have to experience disappointment. They have to have their heart broken by the stupid person that they have a crush on who likes somebody else. They have to go through all that stuff because that's how you become a complete adult human being, right? So that is why I really encourage people to have this talk, because I'm like, how they say eat the frog, do the hardest one first. This is the hardest one. But if you can do this one and you follow some certain rules to do this one, then the next time you have to have an uncomfortable talk with your boss or an employee or your spouse or your siblings or your kids, it's easier because you have a framework that you can fall back on to be able to do it and do it in a healthy adult way.
I love all those points you've made, Colleen, so far. And I love where this conversation is going in terms of having these conversations and how to have these conversations. And also, amidst the landscape of the ever-changing world that we live in and the uncertainty, and helping our younger people through that space, as well as ourselves learning to adult through that space, right? Learning to embrace the uncomfortable. I love that you said adulthood is all about being uncomfortable. I think that's a really good message to our listeners when we think about coaching concepts, because oftentimes we want to smooth things over, which is part of the process and can be, helpful, and can sometimes be part of the coaching process, right? Like, how do we make this the path of least resistance, or the most opportunistic for the individual? On the other hand, we also teach them, our coaching clients, how to sit with the uncomfortable. What does that look like? How does that feel? Really getting in touch with your body and listening to yourself. So just curious, as you go through the conversation with clients, how do you talk about the 4 pillars, and how do you help us have those hard conversations?
Okay, so the 4 pillars include money. Obviously, you need money and revenue to have a business. So we focus on short term, which is like, what's your break-even point? And do you have money in an emergency fund, right? Midpoint is, do you have enough money to pay your taxes? Long term is like, what's your retirement plan? We talk about succession planning just to give people a runway. Like, okay, you want to sell your business, you need to start, having everything start to get organized 5 years before you want to sell. If it's a legacy business, that's a whole lifetime of conversations that you're going to have with people in your life. And then we have the will and trust. Most people, a will is fine. A trust only works in some very specific situations that it's necessary. But we also have insurance. So where the talk comes in is in the insurance part of it. So I have what I call internal and external insurance. So external insurance is like, oh, I don't have enough life insurance. I need to go talk to my insurance guy. Oh, my business, I should get some business insurance since I'm working out of my house and I just want to cover that, as well as homeowners insurance. So you do that. What I do is very physical. So I'm going to need a disability insurance, or to get some living benefit life insurance policy. So, there's those options, which you go out and you talk to somebody. Then there's what I call internal insurance. And this is where these talks come into, because the internal insurance is where you figure out for your family the emergency plan. If something happens to me, who knows what's going on in my life and has access to all my stuff, that can pick it up and make sure my bills are paid, make sure my clients are taken care of. And sometimes, that's one person. Sometimes that's multiple people. If you're married, most of us think like, well, if something happens to me, my spouse. Is your spouse really going to want to run things if you're injured and in a hospital, or you're ill, and their focus is going to be taking care of you? Like, let's look at, backup person B and backup person C or D, and maybe there's more than one person. Maybe there's the one person for your life and there's the one person for your business, but this is where you sit down and you have the hard talks with people. And the talks have goals, right? You don't just sit down and have a talk any old time. No. There always has to be a goal to the talk and an intention going in. right? And one of the things that you have to know going in is that what is important to you and what is important to your loved ones might not be the same thing, right? And, one of the things that really happens with people is where one person wants this thing and you thought the other child wants this thing. And you're like, oh, wait, well, I'll just switch it. That's an easy thing. One thing is like, okay, do I even up my estate so that like if I have 3 kids, they each get a third? Or do I look at my children individually and go, well, this person really needs a house. This person really needs the cash. This person really needs land, and divide things up in a way that might be unequal on paper, but ensures that they get the things they really need. Most people don't think about that. They just think like, oh, I'll just divide it up in thirds. The second one is more complicated, but the second one is probably going to be the one that helps your family stay a family after you've gone. One of the things I always say to parents is, especially if they have adult children, is you've thought you're done with parenting. I mean, you're always their mom, you're always their dad, but they're an adult. They may have your grandkids. They're living their own life. They have their own money worries. And, hopefully if you've launched them successfully and you get to be like a grandparent and have fun. And yeah, maybe they come to you for advice, but you're not doing 24/7, 365 parenting anymore. And so you tend to think like, oh, I'm done with parenting, right? And this is what I say. Having a will and a plan is the last act of being a parent. This is your last parental responsibility because you have an obligation that this family that you've put time and money and love into gets to survive you intact. And if you don't do the work, the chance that is that they can't, right? So for everybody who's not willing to look at this, and like, it's really interesting. They did a a chat with somebody. There was a survey in 2018. And one of the reasons people don't do it, parents don't do it, even like people in the 80s, they felt no urgency. They were fine. It would, it could be happening later. And you're like, you're in your 80s. I mean, come on. And most people, the majority of people said that nothing happened until there was an emergency, which is the last place you want to be when you're trying to make these decisions, right? So this is what I tell people, like going into this, like you're still the parent. This is your last act as a parent, is to prepare your children for the world without you in it. And most people, like, they don't want to think about it, but you've done all kinds of hard jobs as a parent. Before this, you survived teenagerdom. You taught people how to drive. You got them married when they were losing their minds. All of this stuff, you've done hard things before. You can do it again. And so what I tell people is I'm a firm believer in checklists. I even have one. There's a link that'll be in the show notes that you can download my checklist to have this talk. I got this from my dad. My dad was a pilot for 30 plus years. He was a single engine, 4-seater plane person, right? He did that for years and years and years. And my dad never took off without reviewing a checklist to make sure everything was safe, right? And part of that was it was required, but part of that is he understood that hubris could make you forgetful. And people have recognized now that difficult jobs have checklists. So commercial pilots have checklists. Surgeons have checklists. Police officers are starting to embrace this theory. So hard jobs have checklists so that it removes some of the brain power, right? You don't need to think. You can look at the sheet and check and check and check. So That's what I have created because this is a hard job. Now, you need to come at it at a time when you can take the time. This is a 2-hour minimum conversation, right? You want to take breaks. You want to provide water. You want to have snacks. Like, people need calories to be able to have these conversations, so you need to make sure that that you schedule the time where you can take as much time as you need to have the conversation. You need to be open-minded, right? Because this is going to be hard for you. It's probably going to be hard for your children, and you need to really listen to them, because you may have had a plan, but listening to your kids and what they really want and need, you may rethink things, right? And it's also about active listening. Like, you really want to be paying attention to your kids, because, and this is where I really stress it, because you're going to see the little fracture points, that you think they've outgrown, that are going to come up when you're gone, right? And you can see them and you can head them off at the past. You need to consider everyone's emotions, right? Your kids are going to be sad. Your kids are going to maybe get mad at you at some point during the process. They may cry. That's another thing. Have Kleenex, right? All of this stuff comes up, and you always want to have a goal. So at the beginning of it, by the end of this, I want you guys to know X, Y, and Z, right? You start with that, and in your mind, you have an ideal outcome, right? At the end of this, as everything has gone perfectly, this is what it's going to look like. And you always want to aim at understanding. The one thing you're going to have to do, particularly since you're calling the meeting and most people don't think of this, is you have to play the moderator that keeps people on point. Because this is hard, they're going to want to go off somewhere else. They're going to want to talk about something else. And you have to be like, yep, we can talk about that later. This is what we're focusing on today, so that the conversation is productive. And they always say, use I statements, not we statements. I feel, I think. And if you're doing this, say, with a spouse, never say we. Let your spouse express whatever their feelings are as well, because it's much better to have the feelings come up now while you're alive, while you can address them, while you're even aware they exist. Because I think a lot of times parents look at their adult children, remembering who they were as teenagers and whatever the fractures were in the family, and think, oh, they've outgrown that. It's not going to be a problem. And you're like, oh, no, they have not. They are getting along because they're adults, right? The feelings are still there. There are some parts of us that never outgrow our teenage years. There are some parts of us that never leave high school. It's just the facts of life. And if you recognize that, you can moderate for that. But grief is a time when you're not really moderating for a lot of anything. So let's take this and get it out of the way first, right? Because the goal, ultimately, I always stress this for every parent, is you want your family to survive intact when you're gone, right? That is the ultimate goal. I mean, that's why you have a family. You want them to outlive you. You want them to have a legacy. And then there's also the practical things. Okay, who's the executor of your will? Why did you choose them? Some people, it's like they have the one child. Some people, they've decided they're going to pay for a third party to do it because they don't want to put their kids through this process, right? And, you have to also talk about the intangible things. I always encourage people to consider doing an ethical will, where you write a letter to people that you love, telling them their best qualities. Maybe you write down that recipe of those family ingredient, things, that you've never bothered to show anybody because you think, oh, there's time. Like, write it down. Let somebody have it. Who's going to get the photographs, right? Where are the baby books? All of those sorts of non-tangible things that become very important when somebody is gone. Like, start having those conversations as well, because that can be an easier way to get in. Then we talk about the heavy stuff, like the house and the retirement fund and the life insurance and where everything is. But I think, most people, if they've thought about this at all, they have a vision for what they want their legacy to be, and they're structuring things that way. And so by giving your adult children a chance to sit down with you or your siblings or whoever it's going to be, they understand why you made the choices you made because you've explained the vision, right? So that is that about the second week. They've had a little bit of time to get uncomfortable looking at their money, because money always makes everybody uncomfortable. But it also has given them a sense of like, oh, I don't have enough life insurance. Oh, I need to talk to my wife about this. Oh, we should probably add more to our IRA. You have that sense of things so that you can bring it up during the financial part of the discussion, right? So have it with your spouse first, and then as a unit, meet with everybody else in your life. And, if you have a business partner, you're also going to have this conversation with the business partner to figure things out. And you're going to have the conversation more than once, right? This is not a one and done thing, because I always say life happens and we forget the paperwork. I had a guy talk to me and he said, yeah, we just updated our will and realized we hadn't included our third child. And you're just like, you're going to want to do that. So, part of this process is that you schedule follow-up times to have these conversations. So if, you have a business that kind of runs itself, maybe you could do it once every 6 months. If you have a dynamic business where things change a lot, maybe it's once every quarter. If, you and your wife are in the process of building a family, you're going to want to be talking to, your guardians and all of those people once a year to just check in, make sure everything's fine, because you never know. Situations can change. The people that you picked as the temporary guardians, something has happened in their life and they're going to be like, I can't do this, and you'll have to pick somebody else, or, you've moved, things happen. So part of this process is you schedule it, right? So I always tell people, like, okay, so you've talked to your insurance guy and you're getting a new policies and blah, 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 blah. You're going to schedule an appointment a year from that date to sit down and review the situation for everything and be like, do I need to change my will? Do I need to update my will? Do I need to add more life insurance because we've had another kid? Can I drop this? Do I need this anymore? And you need to keep the people who are going to pick up the stuff for you if anything happens. They need to stay in the loop as well. So these conversations are never one and done, but the first one is always the hardest, because the first one is the values conversation. The first one is when you really understand what your parents' financial legacy is going to be, right? And you really know, because I've heard this story a lot of times. Oh, we would ask my mother-in-law, did she have a will? And she kept saying, yes, I have a will, I have a will, I have a will. And then she died and she didn't have a will, right? These conversations guarantee that doesn't happen, because you have the conversation, you're like, where's the will? Who's your estate person, right? And so that you know that information. And if they don't have a will, then you can say, okay, well, then we need to talk about getting you one, because the process of dealing with the court, if you don't have a will, costs time, costs money, costs stress, and you don't want to pay that, right? So when I talk to my parents who have children, I always say to them, your job as a parent is to raise people who can regulate and express their emotions. You have wants for your kids. Everybody has wants for their kids, right? You want them to be happy. You want them to be healthy. You want them to find a great romantic partner if they want to do that. If they want kids, you want them to have wonderful, healthy kids. We all have wants for the kids, but that's not your job. Your job as a parent is to do that. And this is part of that job, is you're helping them regulate and express their emotions so they can do it before you go and after you're gone. So that is the power of these talks.
Wow, so much important information and just invaluable to our listeners. And I'm listening as a parent going, yeah. And of course, I'm sure Eryn as well. So many questions, so many things that we could talk about. I think we could have you on again and again and again. You could probably have your own podcast.
I got to get the business spinning first, and then we'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this is my passion now, because I just think we can do this better as a society. Like, we can just do death better, right? Because while I think my dad's passing taught me it's always sad, but it doesn't have to be tragic. You know what I mean? It's sad, you miss them, but it can be peaceful. And part of it being peaceful is you have taken away so much of the stress.
Well, we are at the point in our podcast episode where we do coaching nuggets of wisdom. And this is just distilling down all of the wonderful information that you have stowed during this conversation, and give the listeners a thought or maybe a key theme that has come up for them to revisit and to maybe even incorporate into their lives. And so what we usually do when we have guests is either Eryn or I go first, and then we then allow our guest, and in this case, Colleen, that would be you, to end it with your own coaching nugget of wisdom as well. Eryn, where are you in that? Do you have a coaching nugget of wisdom, or would you like me to go first?
I guess I can just share, first of all, thank you, Colleen, so much for all of the wisdom and that you shared with us and our listeners on the podcast. And for me, it does keep kind of going back to difficult conversations. And I think that is a skill that's developed over time. So from the coaching lens, I suggest that people, practice those with a coach, counselor, or someone like you, Colleen, practice having those conversations and really, feeling more comfortable when some of those more taboo topics come up. So that's what I would share from today. LaShawn, what about you?
I would like to extend that same sentiment there, Eryn, about preparing for these difficult conversations, and maybe even just doing your own inventory. What are you prepared for? One thing that did come up, Colleen, when you were talking, is it seems that we, for the most part, understand that, death, we need to prepare for death, wills and that. But what we may not be preparing for is long-term care. And that is one thing that I would put out there as an invitation for our listeners, not just for the end of life, for death, but what about long-term care? What about you being alive but not being able to work, or your parents getting a stroke, or something like that requires long-term care? So what are your plans there? Colleen, do you have a coaching nugget of wisdom to add?
So I came across a quote recently that I love, and I wrote down, that is from the book Dr. Zhivago. And it says, "To hope and to act, these are our duty in misfortune." And so I want you to remember that however bad things can be, in illness, in injury, in death, there are always pockets of joy. And that you can, I know that it's hard to know where to begin with this stuff. I do have a starter kit to kind of help some people out that I gave you the thing for, but acting is so important, and just do something. Even if it's just to sit down and write out, what do I want my legacy to be, right? Or even to sit there and go, okay, how many things do I have that require a password and a username? And maybe I should write all of those down and make it a little bit more accessible for people. Just start, because we're all going to face this misfortune. Somebody we love is going to be injured. Somebody we love is going to get ill. Somebody we love will die. And this is our duty, to be able to survive them, to cherish them, to nurse them back to health, and to be okay, to hope and to act. That's our duty in misfortune.
That's so beautifully said. And I love that you ended with a quote. That's fantastic. We have been talking with Colleen Watson, the Chief Legacy Consultant at Century Plant Business Services. And Colleen, can you just tell our listeners before we end where they can find you?
So my website is centuryplantbusinessservices.com. If you want to take advantage of the free 30-minute session, that's on Calendly, calendly.com/centuryplant. And those are both free. And I'm also on LinkedIn. So look me up if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to chat with you at any time. As you can tell, I'm a little passionate about this. I never go for the easy stuff. Like, all my businesses are things people want to avoid, like the flag. But it's the important stuff. And so that's the stuff where the meaning. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
So thankful that both of you had me on today and let me jabber on as I did, because I can just keep going.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings.
Colleen, thank you so much for being so generous with your knowledge.
Very welcome, and thank you so much for having me. This was a lovely hour to spend with you, ladies.